This is lecture 14C. We're going to talk about the Mongol Empire. So Genghis Khan dies in 1227, and the issue of succession comes up. And well, actually, I should just mention that after Genghis Khan dies, the Mongols continue their conquest. They would conquer the rest of the Song dynasty. They would conquer the rest of Persia. They would conquer into the Middle East, Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and then they would push into Eastern Europe, conquering Bulgaria, pushing into Poland. They actually did some raids into Germany, but they conquer all of Russia. And so the full extent of the Mongol Empire isn't reached until after Genghis Khan's death. But when the full extent is reached, from Korea all the way over to Poland, and including down into Persia and China, the Mongol Empire, in terms of total land mass, is the biggest empire the world has ever seen, and probably in terms of the percentage of the world's population, it concluded also at that point. But the Mongol Empire didn't last that long. And part of the reason was dynastic problems. Okay, so when Genghis Khan dies in 1227, he has several sons. The oldest one was actually, there was some questions about his paternity. And the reason for that was that when Genghis Khan had just gotten married and his wife gets kidnapped in a raid by another tribe, and she is kidnapped for 8 months, and the guy who kidnapped her rapes her several times, and then Genghis Khan gets her back after 8 months, and she gives birth. And nobody knew at the time, was Genghis Khan the father? Was she pregnant the whole time she was gone? Or was she impregnated by this other guy? Well, so when Genghis Khan is getting old, Genghis Khan had always recognized his son, the eldest son, as being his son. But when Genghis Khan is in his 60s, the other sons go to him and say, we will not accept that guy as your successor. Even though he's the oldest, we don't think you're his father, so we won't accept him. So Genghis Khan threw him out. Then the second son, Genghis Khan decided wasn't acceptable for some reason. We don't know. There's no evidence of what Genghis Khan didn't like. But he names his third son, Ogedei, as his successor. And so when Genghis Khan dies in 1227, Ogedei becomes Khan. But Ogedei would actually be a fairly ineffective ruler. He basically just, his other brothers continued to lead conquests and things, and Ogedei just sort of sat around, and he probably had a drinking problem. But in any case, he dies in 1241, and then everything starts to break up. And the reason for that is that, Ogedei had some younger brothers who wanted to exert their own, to be sort of independent, and then he has some grandchildren who were becoming major military leaders also, or Genghis Khan's grandchildren. He had some nephews and sons who were becoming major military leaders. And so what happens after Ogedei's death is that the single Mongol Empire breaks up into 4 big khanates. And these 4 big khanates, they continue to sort of work together and to see each other as allies, but they are separate states. The first is the Chagatai Khanate, named after Chagatai, who was one of Ogedei's younger brothers. And this is in Central Asia, okay, modern-day Mongolia, etc., things like that. Then there's the Khanate of the Golden Horde, or the Khanate of Kipchak, which is over in Eastern Europe and big chunks of Russia. Then there's the Ilkhanate of Persia, which is essentially the Muslim territories that the Mongols have conquered. Persia, Mesopotamia, into Anatolia, etc. And then finally, there's the Khanate of the Great Khan, which is China, right? And this is founded by, the Khanate of the Great Khan is founded by one of Genghis Khan's grandsons, Kublai Khan, and Hugelu Khan conquers Persia. And so the Mongol Empire breaks up into 4 parts, and eventually both the Khanate of Persia and the Khanate of the Great Khan in China would collapse on their own, as would the Golden Horde. The Chagatai Khanate would last for a long time, but it's the smallest and least important of the Khanates because it's basically these big wide open grasslands with no major cities in Central Asia. So these are the successor states. Now I want to turn now to talk just a little bit about the nature of Mongol rule and their actions. Now, Genghis Khan himself had this idea that the best way to handle conquest was to say to every city, every kingdom, if you submit to us now and just surrender before we fight, we will be really generous with you. You'll pay us taxes, but we're not gonna rape and pillage and loot. We're not gonna do sort of onerous punishments on you. We're not gonna kill lots of people. We'll be really nice. But if you resist, then we're basically going to try to kill you all. And this policy, it meant that people were terrified of the Mongols, right? Absolutely terrified. Because the Mongols, when they conquered cities, they would just burn them down and they would massacre everybody they came across. They would kill tens of thousands and in some cases hundreds of thousands of people in a time. Once they conquered a city, they would just slaughter and slaughter. And after the Mongols conquered Beijing, it was on fire for over a month, and they were just slaughtering people. And when the Mongols when Hugelu conquered the Abbasid Caliphate, he decided to wipe out the city of Baghdad. The city of Baghdad was 350,000 people at that time, and he basically ordered everybody in the city to be killed. And then he burns down the city, he fills in the wells, he destroys the irrigation ditches, he puts salt in the earth. He basically just destroys Baghdad and wipes it off the face of the earth. Now, they would fairly quickly rebuild the city after a few years. But he basically just wipes out Baghdad and he kills perhaps 350,000 people. We do know that in the largest sense, the Mongols killed, the populations of the territories they conquered, in many cases, dropped significantly over the course of Mongol rule. And I want to point out one thing that's kind of astonishing with this. Mongolia, the Mongols, there were probably about 2 million Mongols. The population of Mongolia was about 2 million. And they're conquering all of China, all of Persia, Eastern Europe. This empire is hundreds of millions of people, and 2 million Mongols are trying to control it. And so they thought that their level of terror was necessary for maintaining control of this vast empire. Right? Now, I mentioned we have pretty good indications that the overall population of the Mongol Empire dropped significantly during the Mongol conquest and then after the Mongols ruled. We don't have exact numbers because there just simply aren't the good records on population numbers, but we have a pretty good sense that, for instance, the Mongols actually openly discussed, they actually debated whether or not they should kill everybody in China and turn China into pasture land. They decided not to, but even though they decided not to, under the Khanate of the Great Khan, the population of China dropped from about 100 million when Genghis Khan began conquering China to about 70 million 100 years later under the Khanate of the Great Khan. So that's a 30% drop in the population of China. And we see these massacres, massacre after massacre after massacre in cities that resisted. And the numbers are just astounding. The Mongols probably killed millions of people. On the other hand, the Mongols did encourage trade. The Mongols were really, for the first time under the Mongols, everything from Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean all the way to China and Korea was under a single ruler. And so the Silk Roads were under a single government. And this allowed for a massive expansion of trade. Historians talk about the Pax Mongolica, the Mongolian peace, which created this sort of free trade zone stretching from China to the Mediterranean under a single government with a single currency and the protection of the Mongols. And this really led to a dramatic increase in trade. Now the Mongols were fairly brutal about ruling, so they often they often taxed certain areas extensively, other areas they left alone, and they also were pretty harsh to the populations that didn't obey them. And so the Mongols were sort of an interesting mix of sort of economic prosperity and then also massive population decline. And it's kind of hard to figure out what to make of that. The other thing I want to talk about is that the Mongols were interesting because after the breakup, the Mongols had very different policies about how they were going to approach the populations they ruled. In China, under the Khanate of the Great Khan, the Mongols were this upper class, and they made it very clear the Chinese were going to be a lower class below them. They made it illegal for Chinese to marry Mongols. They made it illegal to teach the Mongolian language to Chinese. They had separate areas of cities and sometimes entire separate cities for Mongols to live in, separate from the Chinese. And so they really set up this sort of complete division between the Chinese population and the Mongol population. And so the Mongols were this sort of alien ruling class that was never accepted by the Chinese. Even though they ruled for 100 and some years, they were not, the Chinese hated them. But in other places, like in the Ilkhanate of Persia, the Mongols adopted Islam. They converted to Islam and they adopted Persian style of dress, etc. And so they really sort of integrated into the Persian population and became just another ruling class in this Persian empire. And so there were very different approaches there, right? But what's kind of another interesting aspect of the Mongols is that they were pretty religiously tolerant. They did not have an official religion. They actually were very open to Buddhist missionaries, Christian missionaries. They used to have they used to hold debates where they would have a Christian and a Muslim and a Buddhist have discussions about morality, and the Mongols were sort of like, hey, let's figure out what's the best religion here. We'll have a competition, and so there are a lot of ways that the Mongols spread religion. In particular, we see Europeans trying to spread Christianity all the way to China under the Mongols, and there were a number of ways that the Mongols really fostered religion and religious innovation. But the Mongol state didn't last. Right? The Mongols erupted in the 1200s. By the 1250s, they had conquered pretty much everything they were going to conquer. And by the 1360s, they were gone. So the reign of the Mongol Empire was really only about 100 years. They spent 50 years conquering and then about 100 years ruling, and then it fell apart. Right? We're going to talk about some of the reasons for it falling apart later. I mean, a couple of reasons. They did a number of things that were economically destabilizing, like trying to introduce paper money without gold backing it. They also had some problems with, the Black Death emerged right at the end of Mongol reign, and that might have been the last thing that polished off the Mongols in various parts of their empire. But in the end, it's probable the Mongols simply didn't ever figure out a way to really create the kind of stable bureaucracy that could create a durable government. And partly that's because, we've seen already that oftentimes an official religion is a great foundation for stabilizing a society. The Mongols never adopted an official religion. But we can also see that the Mongols really weren't that interested in bureaucracy. They certainly had bureaucrats, but they simply weren't the sorts of genius organizers that, say, the Tang Dynasty in China, or the Abbasids were. And so they never created a stability. And so in a sense, the Mongols became a sort of flash in the pan. They erupt out of nowhere in the early 1200s. They conquer the biggest empire the world's ever seen. It lasts 100 years, and then it collapses.